At least not the view I was looking for. There we go. All right. Well, good evening to those of you that are participating tonight. First of all, I want to thank Philip and April for helping to organize the program and inviting me to be a part of it to kick off these series of sessions of discussing hay production here in Kentucky. And I've been tasked tonight to talk about weed control issues relative to hay production, and that's what we're going to do. And if as we go through this, if some of you have some questions, we can try to address those, particularly at the end of our session. Most of what I am going to discuss tonight is related to grass hay production, which is the primary types of hay that we produce in Kentucky, although we could touch on alfalfa hay if some individuals have some specific questions that they'd like to discuss related to producing alfalfa. To begin to talk about weed control issues in our pastures or forage production systems, what intrigues me as I drive around Kentucky is the differences in the vegetation that you see, often just separated by a fence row. Obviously, the field on your right is probably more typical of a heavily grazed pasture field, where you see a lot of tall weeds that emerge and that are often prevalent in those fields. Whereas on the left is more typical of what you might see from a hay field that's been more recently cut. That doesn't mean that there aren't some hay, that there's not some weeds that exist in those hay fields, but often they're just not as evident as they might be if that field had been primarily used for grazing purposes. So again, my focus is primarily on weeds in hay fields. There will be some overlap perhaps with some of the more typical weeds that we also see in grazed pastures. So I want to put a quick list of weeds together that I often either get questions about or see that we have in our hay fields. First of all, just some of the more common summer annual broadleaf weeds that we might encounter, things like common ragweed or common cocklebur, as well as some of the pigweed, specifically probably see more spiny amaranth pigweed in our forage crops, forage fields, than we do some of the other species of the amaranths or the other pigweeds. And then we have some biennial weeds, or weeds that typically we think last more than 1 year, maybe 2 years. They still only reproduce by seed, and that's the biennial thistles like musk thistle. And I know in the northeast part of the state you have quite a bit more of this plumeless thistle, which are considered to be biennial thistles, and then poison hemlock, which is also another plant that's classified as a biennial, but I'm not so sure that a lot of our thistles, and as well as poison hemlock, probably grow more as winter annual species. And then we have certainly a whole host of perennial species or plants that are not capable of reproducing by seed, but also from their vegetative systems, their roots or root crowns. Things like curly dock, the plantains. I did include tall ironweed on that list. We can still see goldenrod and some others that grow a lot like tall ironweed. I know in your area that Canada thistle is probably a little more prominent than it is in other parts of the state. Can be a real problem thistle species as a perennial. And then hemp dogbane and or common milkweed occasionally are some other perennial plants that look fairly similar, but they are different species. I don't know how much often you deal with tickclover, also known as sticktights, a little plant that looks a little bit like a clover, a soybean plant as far as the leaves. It is another legume. but those can show up in hay fields. We typically don't see those in pasture fields because cattle will graze those particular species. I did want to include some winter annual weeds that can show up and be a little problematic sometimes in hay fields. Primarily, probably get more concerned about these species I have listed here, from the mustards, the dead nettle, henbit, chickweed species, and new seedings is where they tend to be much more problematic, particularly for fall seeded forage hay fields. And then the other group, moving on into the grasses or the monocot type species, particular things like foxtail and Johnsongrass. Still some hay fields may have some broom sedge issues, as well as probably 2 or 3 other grasses that we could list as well. And then occasionally I get questions about yellow nut sedge, which is one of the sedges that sometimes we find in some of these fields. So this is just kind of a quick list of the 20 plants or so that that we could be encountering. So there's a whole group of different plants. Some of them are annuals, some are perennials, some are more commonly seen in the early part of the season or in the spring of the year. Others are more prominent and dominate the areas in late summer. So there's a lots of different complex of species that we deal with. So that being said, what are the tools in the toolbox for control? Here's just the kind of my quick overview of our different weed control methods or different weed control options, starting with cultural practices, the things that we do or don't do or could do that can impact the type of vegetation that exists on some of these landscapes. Also want to include mechanical controls that, since we're talking about hay fields, we're probably talking primarily about cutting schedules or cutting times in relation to helping to deal with some weed problems, and or mowing, I guess, could be part of that equation as well. And then what herbicides or chemical control options that we might have available to us to control some of these species. And then the fourth one I have listed down there is prevention, which is kind of we don't always think about that per se, but if we see something other that may be a problem down the road and kind of understand the plant is not a plant we want to get started, let's do what we can to prevent it from getting established and becoming a dominant part of the weed spectrum that we're trying to deal with. I'm going to dive into these a little bit more and kind of give a little more of a background of why I think that particularly these top 3 are important and part of the control options that we can deal with. The first of all, when we think about some of these fields, and this is picture is probably a little more representative of pastures than a lot of hay fields, but the point I want to make with this is, as you look at this photo, obviously there's some weeds in the picture here, but there's also a lot of open bare areas. And what's going to be that's not part of the primary forages we're trying to control, and what is going to show up in those bare areas? Weeds. That's a lot of times, to me, weeds are indicators, particularly the annual weeds are indicators of fields that have a lot of open and bare areas that allow those weeds to germinate and to occupy those spaces. So as we think about the weed control side of things, the weed management side of things, to me, this is an underlying aspect of some of the issues that we deal with sometimes. The weeds are just indicating that we may have some other production practices that need to be implemented. So having said that, we think about our cultural mechanical practices, which are some of the management decisions that we can make. Sometimes my recommendation is let's do something other to improve the overall forage grass. And when we have a lot of bare open spots, one of the best practices we can do is obviously interseeding or getting more grass established in those areas so that they're able to compete better and create some ground cover that helps minimize the weeds that might be there. I didn't say eliminate, because it's almost impossible to eliminate weed problems, but a thicker stand of desirable forage species is one of the first steps in weed control. Along with that is maintaining proper soil fertility and soil pH levels. I'm not going to dwell on these points very long, other than to say that that is part of weed management, in my opinion, is being sure that we are doing the things, giving the desirable species the nutrients and the nutrient availability to again make them more competitive, so that they will help outgrow and minimize the presence of some weed species. And then the other point I want to point out is more related to the mechanical side of things, is when we're cutting grass hay in particular, how do we pay attention to the cutting height of that grass? So from a weed management perspective, is if we're cutting that down close to ground level, that the lower we cut that, the more sunlight we allow to hit the soil surface. There's two primary factors that come into play in regards to weed seed germination, oftentimes are the two primary factors. One is soil moisture and or rainfall, and the other sunlight. So when we have a good lush stand of grasses and other vegetation on the landscape, the sun doesn't penetrate that to help trigger germination. But light is one of the factors that triggers seed, particularly weed seed, to germinate. So if we're cutting that real close to the ground, then we are allowing sunlight to penetrate that, and then with a little bit of moisture, the weeds can oftentimes get the jump on becoming reestablished before the desirable grasses can get reestablished, which is the other second point related to this, is the fact that when we cut those grasses down real short, we really starve out their ability to rebound quickly. So we force that plant to use up a lot of carbohydrates in the root system to those grasses to get reestablished, and it creates a weaker plant, and again allowing the weedy plants to become much more aggressive. But I'm going to leave those points as they are, and I suspect your other speakers the next few weeks will probably highlight some of these issues a little bit more than I can give it justice. But the main point I want to leave you with is any type of management practice or activities that promotes the growth of the desirable forage species, that's the goal, to minimize the impact of the weedy species that which are the more undesirable species that are in the system. And in fact, I've often said that at least 60% or more of weed control in our forage grass system is related back to our cultural and other management practices that we may do or are unable to get done. And I also realize that timeliness can be a part of that equation, and it's not always feasible to get things done in the timely manner like we'd like to. But my main point is if we think about these things, sometimes investing our time and our effort and the dollars into these type of activities can maybe pay more dividends than just trying to get rid of the problem with a quick fix. So having said that, from the cultural and the mechanical side of things, we do have some herbicide tools that we can use, particularly for broadleaf weeds in a lot of our grass pastures and hayfields. Now, the foundation herbicide active ingredient that we find in most products is probably 2,4-D. We can buy it as a single product. It's been around for years. Either the amine or the ester formulations of those products, the low volatile esters is particularly There's a whole host of different products available. There is a newer formulation of 2,4-D that's in the marketplace. I don't know if it's widely available yet for a lot of farm stores yet, but it's a 2,4-D choline salt. It's it's a lower volatility potential than the other formulations of the old 2,4-Ds. Then we have what I call the dicamba based products. We typically don't use dicamba by itself, which is sold in products like Clarity. More often than not, I'm going to recommend that we use a dicamba 2,4-D mixture, whether it be Weedmaster, Rifle D, Brash, I think is another one. There's a number of those products, and they've been around for years. But this combination right here, the dicamba 2,4-D, can be a good fit for many of the weeds that we deal with. And then we have the Triclopure based products. Most of you have heard of Crossbow. There's a product out there called Crossroad. It's basically the same thing as this product is now in more of the generic form. Pasture Guard, which was Triclopure, you take the 2,4-D out and replace it with Fluoxapure. Has been on the market for a little while. This probably fits much more often with some of the more woody type of weed species that we deal with. And then we have the suite of aminopyrrolid based products. We typically don't use aminopyrrolid by itself, but this Grazon Next initially was sold as Forefront, which is a 2,4-D combination with aminopyrrolid. There is a product called Chaparral, which has metsulfuron in it, that has more of a niche purposes. And then the one that was released just a year ago is Duracor. And again, the base of that particular herbicide is aminopyrrolid. Takes out the 2,4-D and adds another growth regulator. I won't try to pronounce that for you here tonight. From what I can tell at this point in time, the type of control you can expect out of Duracor is not much different than what you can expect out of Grazon Next. It's just the differences in some of the active ingredients that's in that mixture. And then if you wanted to use just straight metsulfuron, now these are non-growth regulator chemistries. It initially was sold as a product called Ally and Cimarron. You can't get those two products now, but you can buy it in some other product names if you're looking for the same individual active ingredient. Again, this is kind of more of a niche for certain weed species. It can have an advantage over some of the others. And then another new one on the marketplace for use in pasture fields and hay fields is Sharpen. And it is kind of, again, has a very select fit. In fact, I want to talk about that one a little bit more. But first of all, I want to say is to match up some of these herbicides that best fit for different weed species. That publication that Philip mentioned earlier has pictures on one side and then has a chart on the back side. Helps give you a little bit of an idea of what kind of control you can expect from some of these different chemistries on that list. I'm in the process of updating that guide to include some of these newer products that are not yet listed there. But I want to mention Sharpen a little bit more to give you a better idea of where its fit might be. Mainly, it may help us control some of the annual broadleaf weeds, things like cockleburr and the ragweed and perhaps the pigweeds. The key to this is they need to be applied when those weeds are emerged and less than 6 inches tall would be the target size for control. It's a low use rate product, 1 to 2 fluid ounces of product per acre. It needs to be mixed with the methylated seed oil. It is more of a contact herbicide, unlike the other products we mentioned that may take a little longer to see activity. It's more of a leaf burn activity that we see from that. There are no grazing or hay cutting restrictions, which is a plus. And also, the Sharpen can be applied and seeded, as far as grasses, can be seeded pretty much immediately after application, or there's no waiting period before seeding grasses. The thing to realize about Sharpen is it may burn the tops of perennial weeds, but it does not control perennial weed species. So if you're looking for something more broad spectrum, control for a variety of perennial as well as some of the annual weeds, then Sharpen's probably not going to be the fit. Just to give you an idea what Sharpen looks like, again, it's more of a leaf burn. Its effect is what you can expect out of Sharpen. I have looked at this product for cockleburr and ragweed control, and I've actually been pretty impressed that it does have a nice niche for certain issues such as that. But having said that, and talk a little bit more about herbicide options, herbicides can be quite effective if they're applied at the right time. This is a demonstration plot that I initiated several years ago, which I sprayed different strips of different herbicide products. This happens to be Grazon Next. Obviously, it's a pretty broad spectrum control. This field had some ironweed and some other perennial species is the reason why that it looks so good. This is what the untreated area looks like. And then if I back up again, that's the treated area. So these herbicides can, particularly those that are intended for broadleaf weeds, if we pick the right product for the given situation, we can effectively remove a lot of the weedy species that are there. Of course, the dilemma is, in this particular case, I don't know how well you're able to see it on your screen here, up in front of this picture is some red clover, which you don't see in this picture. So we do have some trade-offs sometimes when we decide to use a herbicide, but the real question I've posed to some audiences is, which of these two areas actually give you the most forage to graze, or the forage available in the case of hay production, which one would provide you the most desirable material to use or to gain from developing good weed control. But I'm going to use a pasture example. That particular study I just mentioned was not set up to collect data, but Philip and I a few years ago did do a research trial up there in Lewis County, and this was a grazed pasture field in which we had strips that were sprayed with a herbicide and strips that did not get sprayed. And then we collected the biomass of the vegetation out of some subsamples out of each of these strips, and then determined how much of the different types of species that were present. The photo you're looking at is actually 1 year after treatment. And again, this field was dominated a lot by tall ironweed, which was the predominant broadleaf species in this particular field. So if you look at the results from when we collected the samples, and then we took those back. Well, first of all, we took those samples from each site, and then we separated the forage grasses from the weedy species, primarily tall ironweed, and there was some horse nettle that we separated out as well. This field did not really have, for all practical purposes, didn't have much of a clover stand, so we didn't include clover. But if you look at the total biomass, and that's the total of what was collected, here in the red bar is the untreated strip areas, and there are 4 strips per treatment. And the green bar is the herbicide, which is Grazon Next. And if you look at the total biomass on a pounds of dry weight basis, yeah, you see that there's a little bit of difference here in this bar chart, but statistically or significantly, they're not different. So the total amount of biomass was not really different between the two. But if you look at the amount of forage grass we had available to utilize as a desirable species, we had almost twice as much, or we had twice as much desirable grasses on the treated area, herbicide treated area versus the untreated area. Where's the difference? It's tied up in the weeds, particularly this tall ironweed and a little bit of horse nettle that was there. So do weeds compete with a desirable species? Yes, they do. Now, the field I just showed you is probably more of a more drastic example of a field heavily dominated by a weed like tall ironweed, you may not see this dramatic of a results or benefit from removing those weeds from those fields, but there's at some level of weeds that can impact a field in which we do reduce the amount of desirable forages available for us to utilize. And this just represents the more of a quantity perspective of lost forage that is present. The other side of that equation is the quality of the feed or the hay that might have been produced from a field such as this, is just as an example of how weeds can impact the amount of available and desirable forages for us to utilize. So when is the best time of year to apply herbicides? Well, on a good extension answer, it depends. And when it comes to weeds, as I mentioned from the beginning, is we have a different complex of different weeds that exist or can exist in some of these forage fields that we're dealing with. So in order to target those best, sometimes we may need to become a little more familiar with what those weeds are and what's their life cycle, or when do they grow? When do they begin their growth cycle for the season or the year, and when do they reproduce? And in keeping in mind, if we're thinking about using herbicides as options, herbicides often work best on younger, more actively growing weeds. Many times we don't see some of these problems until these weeds are mature or producing flowers. And at that point in time, it would be unbeneficial or not beneficial to use some type of control tactic such as a herbicide for removal at that point in time. But we have to learn something about those weeds, what they are. And if you need some help on identifying some of these plants, I know the county extension offices would be more than glad to help you identify some of these plants if you're not familiar with some of the plants that you're dealing with. Just in general, we talk about the cool season weeds. Many times those are winter annuals, or could be the thistles or things like poison hemlock. Just as a general reference, the best time to target those chemical wise or herbicide wise is here in the early spring or even late fall. Realizing some of these weeds will start germinating in the fall, even when we still have relatively warm weather. It's certainly cooler than it is midsummer, but that's when they begin that cycle of germinating. Of course, when they overwinter, they may become somewhat dormant. But if we can catch them whenever they're coming just out of dormancy, depending on what weeds they are, that's one of the better times to maybe target some of these cooler season weeds. As far as summer annuals, that needs to happen more in early summer. Things like the ragweed and the cocklebur and so forth. And again, oftentimes we don't think about these kind of weeds until they become much more mature or beginning to the reproductive phases. But if we can target those more in early to midsummer, but the problem with that is, when we talk about herbicides, is midsummer can be a little bit dicey at times about supplying some of those herbicides that are more subject to volatility due to hot, humid weather. So we got to be a little more cautious about the location and the weather conditions as far as targeting those and picking the time of the day to target those. That's one reason why another advantage maybe a Sharpen is that it isn't subject to volatility. So that's just a little side note there. And then the perennial species, in general, this is a very general comment, like to think about targeting those more in late summer. Now, we may get excited about trying to deal with some of these in the early part of the year or midsummer when they seem to have a lot of active growth. But my experience and has indicated that a lot of these perennials are trying to build back the root system in in late summer and early fall. So if we can get the herbicide into those actively growing plants when they're moving, much of their energy is moving down back into the root system so that they can overwinter and produce new plants the next year. A lot of times we can be much more successful. So just some general thoughts about targeting the time of year. So it's important to know what weeds are, but also the disheartening thing sometimes is that there is no one best time to get all weeds. But you've got to kind of pick and choose which are your predominant species that you're most concerned about in order to target those plants at that point in time. There are some issues which can limit herbicide use in these pastures and hayfields. One of the first ones that we hear a lot is, I don't want to kill the clover. So these fields that have legumes in them, where we know some of the benefits of legume species, if there's enough legume to justify it having benefits. But many of those broadleaf herbicides I've talked about can cause damage to clover, and or actually can remove the clover from those fields for at least a short period of time. Might mention as a side note that some of you probably have heard that Corteva is in the process of developing a product that will have some clover tolerance, but if you will pay attention to what their literature says, they're talking about white clover tolerance and not red clover. And part of that is because that product does have 2,4-D is one of its active ingredients. And it's not yet available, but is expected to be available fairly soon. The other thing is the timing of effective treatment. I sort of touched on this a little bit earlier in the previous slide, but oftentimes we fail to see the problem until after the fact. And I sort of alluded to that earlier, is when we have mature plants, again, we don't get the control that we'd like to see. It's better to target younger actively growing plants. We have to be aware of sensitive crops or other vegetation nearby, as far as when we make some of these applications to avoid off-target movement to some of these crops that can be somewhat sensitive. We need to pay attention to the hazing and grazing restrictions. Most of those herbicides have a no waiting period for grazing, but there might be a 30-day or so waiting period, or 15 to 30-day waiting period before we can cut that for hay. Part of that is to allow the herbicide to work, and the other is to make sure that there's that meets the guidelines for the residue potential that per the label. There can be a cost factor in play that can some individuals have to think about. Does the cost of treatment justify the cost of the herbicide treatment justify the benefit? For me, when it comes to from the economics side of the equation, what I'd like to think about is, what did it do for me a year from the time of application? Did I gain some benefit from that particular treatment? And another important factor is reseeding forages. If I make a herbicide application, how long must I wait before I can reseed? And from a lot of those herbicides, and it varies, but it may be at least 15 days, oftentimes 4 to 6 weeks after the application before we can reseed some of our forage species, particularly the clovers. The other side of that is, if I have a new seeding of forages or forage grasses, how long does it have to get established before I can consider making a herbicide application? And in general, we talk about it being a well-established root system. A lot of the labels are not extremely clear, but some of them will start saying that when you got 3 to 4 true leaves is sufficient enough, but just be aware of what those limitations are. The other thing about using the aminopyrrolate-based herbicides, there's a diagram on the label that talks about keeping track of where those fields are, including hay. because when this herbicide is applied on the field and that herbicide is tied up into the hay field, into the hay bale, that dry hay, that herbicide could stay there. And then fortunately, some of those hay bales have ended up as mulch for use on home gardens or even other more high value crops, and can cause problems due to this aminopyrrolate chemistry that gets bound in that hay, and then once moisture hits it, then it gets released. The other thing to keep in mind, if you're using those kind of herbicides for hay production, you need to be very much aware of where that hay is being utilized, hopefully on your own farm. But if you're selling that to a buyer, they need to be aware that of the potential consequences if that hay ends up being used in some type of composting or other uses. So to kind of summarize a little bit of what I've talked about so far is effective weed control starts by establishing and maintaining healthy hayfields. That to me is an underlying point that we need to think about. If we're going to, in order to have effective weed control, we need to do what we can. And I know that's easier for me to state than to occur. In particular, we have the weather conditions, environmental conditions. We have a dry summer, and it just totally negates everything we've tried to accomplish up to that point. The other point is integrating different control strategies, different methods together is an important part of the equation, and not relying just on one tactic to get good weed control. We can have the best herbicide in the world to selectively take the weeds out that we want to kill, but when those weeds die and leave bare spots, what grows back in those bare spots is to be more weeds. So we got to think about it as an overall integrated approach to do that. And there's not one shoe that fits all, as far as from what I'm able to determine from a weed control standpoint. But there are some things that we can do to help move us in the right direction of minimizing the weed pressure. Now, having said that, I want to talk more about some specific situations for the next few minutes. And I'm going to start by tackling what I consider some of the biggest challenge, and that's these weedy grasses in hayfields. Things like the annual grasses, like the yellow foxtail and Johnsongrass, the two I want to highlight tonight. But we have some other weedy grasses that we might see in some of these fields as well. But I want to just give you some thoughts as to what some of my general ideas are as to how to deal with these. And the first one I want to talk about is Johnsongrass. Johnsongrass was actually introduced as a forage crop in Virginia a number of years ago. And it was a good forage crop because it was, once it became established, it was very difficult to get rid of. And it has some forage value in its vegetative growth stages. Now, this grass is a warm season perennial, and by that, what that basically implies is it grows best under hot conditions. It really doesn't kick in and start growing for the season until at least June, and then July and August and September, it is thriving at the time when our cool season grasses like orchard grass and fescue and so forth are on kind of in their summer slump. So it can be a real problematic in these hay fields, particularly not the first cutting of hay, but those later in the seasons is when it can be a real problem once it gets a foothold in some of these fields, which comes back to this prevention point that I made earlier. Is if you see just a clump or two of Johnsongrass in a field that you're utilizing as a grass hay field, it may be well worthwhile to spend a lot of effort to try to keep that population at bay before it gets out of hand. It can reproduce by rhizomes or underground stems as well as seed, but this has probably become one of our biggest challenges in these grass hay fields. And I think part of the issue that I see is with those later cuttings, particularly when we have the seed head on those plants at the time these fields are cut, we continue to spread that field around in those fields and continues that propagation. And it really points out when we're doing the same thing in a particular field area year after year, and you get a weed like Johnsongrass gets a toehold or a foothold, it just continues to begin more of a problem, and it's not an easy solution unless we change. In my opinion, we've got to change our management system. We have to do something different. But trying to continue to grow just grass hay and cut grass hay off those fields for 2 to 3 cycles per year is probably going to continue to increase the problem rather than minimize it, because we really don't have any selective herbicides that will selectively control the grass, the Johnson grass, and not cause potential damage to our desirable grasses. Granted, there are some products that the highway department use to target some Johnson grass, but if those products are used at too high of a rate, they do cause damage to the desirable grasses. And at the lower rates that they're using, they're really just creating a cosmetic effect and not really greatly reducing the population that the Johnson grass is there. So having said that, there may be some opportunities for some situations, and I realize this is not practical for everyone, is still cut the spring hay like we normally do. And then if we have fencing and we have a water supply and we have animals that we could utilize, let's just let the animals graze the Johnson grass. And if you think about it, we very seldom see Johnson grass in a grazed pasture field. And why that is because the animals are utilizing it as a forage. They are constantly grazing the plant, which helps starve out that root system or the rhizomes. So if we can take advantage of that, use those animals as a way of removing top growth, and this would be more effective than just trying to intensively mow it. And this is not a one-year quick fix either. But if we can do that, of course, we got to realize that we've got to get those animals off of there before frost, because this plant can become toxic for a period of time when it becomes stressed with things like frost. So there's a management factor there as well. But if we can be creative and we have the animals that's part of our system, and we've got the other things in place, then it may be something as a way to change up the system for a period of time and still get some grass hay cut there in the spring or the early part of the summer. The other primary method is thinking about those hay fields, particularly if they're fields that could be rotated to a field crop for a few years, particularly a grain crop like soybean or corn. Doing something different. We do have some herbicide tools that can effectively control Johnson grass. Then that's another way that we can break up that cycle, because these hay fields will get to a point at some point in time we have to do something different. We might be able to rotate them to alfalfa as another alternative there. Going back to the grain crops, at least the price of soybeans and corn has rebounded actually considerably over the past this past 6 months to a year. So there may be some opportunities again now to utilize some of these grain crops as a way to work on some of these fields. Just throwing out some ideas, some thoughts there as far as ways to deal with it with this particular weedy grass in grass hay. As far as alfalfa is concerned, obviously, if we could plant a glyphosate or a Roundup ready alfalfa variety, we can use the glyphosate as a good tool there. We can also, in a pure stand of alfalfa, use clethodim, which is sold under a variety of product names. Post is another option, although I would much rather have clethodim than I would post if I'm going to try to be a little more serious about trying to control and suppress the Johnson grass. The other grass I wanted to mention tonight is this one, which is yellow foxtail. This may be familiar to some of you. Again, a late summer is when you see that. Yellow foxtail is a summer annual, but it's really more problematic as we get into that latter part of the summer, and it can be a real problem. I've even had a question here this past month from an individual who had some hay being fed to horses, which had foxtail in it. Those heads can have bristles that can be interfere with horses being fed hay that has foxtail in it. So it can be a real problem for the hay that has a lot of foxtail in it. From a cultural practices standpoint, I think this one fits a lot more of improving the stand of the desirable grasses. And as that photo I showed you just a moment ago, you see these areas where you have a lot more dense foxtail than others. To me, those are probably areas that have a lot more bare open spots. And we need to correct those areas if we're going to, it's probably the target of realizing that we have some open, thin areas. We need to do some overall improvement in order to promote the desirable grasses and doing those things that make that much more conducive. As far as mowing or clipping fields before new seed is produced, this is one of those that, yes, can help some, but my experience has been that we can clip that off when we think is an optimum time to minimize seed head production, but there are oftentimes enough time for more seed to be produced or seed heads emerge after we've clipped. As far as herbicides, we do have a product I haven't mentioned yet. Some of you may be aware of, called Prowl, particularly Prowl H20, that's labeled now for grass pastures. It's a little bit different than the other herbicides we talked about. It has to be applied before weeds germinate. And for this to work for some of these hay fields, I think it would need to perhaps be applied immediately after that first hay cutting, and whenever the hay is removed, and try to get the herbicide on just as soon as possible, where I'm basically immediately after the hay is removed, to try to get it on the ground before that sunlight triggers much germination of a weeds like foxtail. I think that a lot of the yellow foxtail, when we have that first growth of hay in the early part of the year, there's very little or no foxtail underneath that because it doesn't have the sunlight to help trigger germination. But once the soil temperatures warm up, and then we cut that field again, if we cut that down real close, we're going to allow a lot of sunlight to hit that soil surface and help trigger that germination. And that's part of, I think, whenever this foxtail becomes more prevalent, is as we get into that next cycle of cutting. Just a little quick reminder about Prowl. Some of you may remember this as a tobacco herbicide, and for some other uses. It targets basically annual grasses and some small seeded broadleaf weeds like the pigweeds. And again, I cannot emphasize enough, for it to work, it has to be on the ground before weed seeds germinate. After weed seeds germinate, it's going to be highly ineffective. So finding that window is going to be a hit and miss. So I kind of hesitate sometimes to recommend it as a possibility, but under some circumstances, it may be something to think about and probably use on a small scale before using it on a larger scale. There's a pretty wide rate range. I'd certainly try to be up here at least in the 3 to 4 pint, 1 to 2 quart rate at a minimum to be effective. There's no grazing or harvest pre-harvest restrictions with it. It can also be used on alfalfa, an alfalfa cool season forage grass mixture. But again, there's still some things I think we need to learn and try to figure out when is the best time to make that effective. In fact, some older data, a graduate student I had a number of years ago, and this is on pigweed, where we looked at Prowl applied at different times, March, April, May, and June. And you can see kind of the bubble here is the March application, the control was about 70%, April was the best. And part of this is the herbicide probably degraded before the major flush occurred of a weed like pigweed. And then when we got into May and June, most of that weed had germinated before the herbicide was applied. So we didn't get as good a control by delaying our applications and later into the summer. So that's kind of the situation with Prowl. Let me touch on a couple other weeds here as a wrap up. One is common ragweed. For example, if we have a good, fairly decent stand of grass hay, don't see a lot of this, but it can be a problem in some fields. By cutting and managing this and preventing new seed production, particularly in early August, when you see these seed heads and pollen being produced in early August, that's that prime time to cut and clip this field, cut these fields, try to minimize the new seed being produced. This plant only reproduces by seed. Again, thicken the forage stand. When I see a lot of ragweed in these fields, to me, that's an indication we have a lot of open bare areas in those fields, is the reason why you see a lot of common ragweed. Here's a study that I was involved with a couple years ago. Again, I primarily was looking at Sharpen and Permit as a couple newer products compared to our standards like 2,4-D. I used actually the Freelex formulation, Weed Master, Graze on Next, and Pasture Guard. I used Pasture Guard instead of Crossbow because I wanted something that did not have 2,4-D in the mix, since these other three do. And then we did do a mowing in August, in about mid-August. The herbicides were applied in mid-June. The ragweed was 6 to 12 inches, a little taller than I think was ideal, but still was sufficient. And as you can see, the Sharpen this is 3 months after the treatment, was just as effective as Weed Master and Graze On. What was surprising is the Pasture Guard was a little bit less, as well as the 2,4-D. On that size of common ragweed, the 2,4-D is not, and this has been true with some other studies as well, that the 2,4-D it's acceptable in some respects, but still not as good as some of these other herbicides. Again, this was a stage of growth at the time of application. This field actually had cocklebur and ragweed in it, in a pretty heavy population of both. You couldn't throw down a quarter without hitting one of those weeds in much of that field. But the other side of that coin, using that phrase again, and that's just an example of Weed Master, and this was true with most of the other herbicides that were highly effective. We removed the broadleaves, but you can't see it very well in this photo, but it did leave. Then what came in next were a lot of the weedy grasses, things like foxtail and crabgrass. So again, it's a complete, I mean, we've got to think about what are the overall consequences. We can remove some of those weed competition, but if we don't do something other else later to improve the other desirable species, then we might have some other issues to deal with as well. Let me touch on a perennial, a tall ironweed. Again, not as big of a problem in most grass hay fields that I see, but I occasionally do see it in some fields that can be a problem. Now we're dealing with a perennial species that reproduces not only seeds, but also these root buds that can be in play. Here's kind of the general control methodology that I've developed based on several studies over the years. Is I'd like to see these fields either cut for hay or clipped if they're pasture fields in mid to late summer, usually sometime in July. Allow the regrowth to develop, where we have some good young vegetated growth that comes up a little bit later. Gets to be about 12 to 24 inches tall at most. And then we're going to spray that with an effective herbicide, something that contains either triclopyr or aminopyrrolid, there in August to early September. Now, there's a kind of a window there, is that if we wait too late into September, this plant begins to decline fairly rapidly in the fall. So we want some active growth in order to do that. And then depending on whether or not we want to reseed clovers in some of these fields the next year, we've got to kind of pick and choose maybe which products to use. But the other reason I wanted to use tall ironweed is because I often get questions about, what about using a Wick or a Roto-Wiper as a way to control some of these taller weeds in these fields. And we had another student that did some work a few years back looking at Roundup, Milestone, which is what's the active ingredient that's in Grazon next, if you will, and then Remedy, which is what the active ingredient that's in Crossbow. And the results you're seeing here for this first column of data is the control 4 weeks after treatment. And that was a 50 mix of Roundup and different ratios of Milestone as a solution mix that was in the mix, and then used a rope wick to wick across these taller plants. And the control ranged from 90, 95 to 80% control. And this is 4 weeks after treatment. A broadcast treatment of Forefront, which is the same thing as Grazon, was about the same. Now, there were some statistical differences, but for all practical purposes, everything was above 80% control 4 weeks after treatment. And what I said earlier, I think I said earlier, is I'm more interested in what did it do a year after the fact. So here's the Roundup, 50-50 mix through a rope wick had dropped to 34% control. We had to have a 20% concentration of Milestone to get to 66% control, whereas our broadcast application of Forefront was still above 80% control of tall ironweed, of reducing the tall ironweed population. That was at one location near Lexington, up in northern Kentucky and Boone counties. Same set of treatments, basically. 1 year after treatment, the control was really not much different than we saw at the other location, but we also had 2 other broadcast treatments. There's the Grazon or Forefront, and then pasture guarded Crossbow, all of them above 70% control. These cost factors is just a general idea on a cost per acre basis. It's hard to figure that on these through a rope wick because it depends on how dense the population is. But the point is, in concept, these weed wipers have some, the concept sounds good, but they have limitations as to how effective they might be as far as getting herbicide into the plant and then to the root system of the plant of a weed like tall ironweed. Here's some of the kind of the quick pros and cons of weed wipers. You know, for all practical purposes, pretty simple to operate and so forth, but there's a lot of inconsistency in the weed control that we have. You got to control the output. The thicker that vegetation, the weeds are you're trying to control, the harder that is to do. A real thick stand of weeds, even Johnsongrass. I've talked to individuals who've tried to use weed wipers for Johnsongrass control. On thicker stands, when you go look at it a year after the fact, you miss a lot because you can't keep enough herbicide into the system. You have to be aware about slopes. If you've got a long wick in a tube, most of it's going to run downhill where you have a lot of material, a lot of herbicide that may drip, particularly if it's something like Roundup, whereas you may not have little or none on the upslope. So just some quick thoughts about weed wipers. Again, I'm going to kind of wrap up here quickly because I've been trying to answer a few questions, but Tickclover, I just want to mention that from the standpoint, again, this is more of a hayfield weed. Some of you may have seen this where you have a continuous hayfield. Looks a little bit like a soybean plant. It's a perennial legume. This is another one of those that you could do a spring hay harvest like you normally do, but if you can graze that, because this weed is using the animals to utilize it as a forage is one way of doing that. There are these herbicides like pasture guard or triclopyr based or aminopyrrolate based herbicides are quite effective on that particular species. The last thing I think I want to mention here, and then I'll open up for questions, is occasionally we get questions about controlling weeds in annual forage grasses, things like annual ryegrass, sorghum sudan, and millets and so forth. For the most part, 2,4-D can be used on those particular summer annuals as well as dicamba. Not on the millets, but at least the sorghum sudan and the ryegrass. Actually, sorghum sudan, we can actually use atrazine in some cases. I did want to include teff because I know some individuals have been interested in using growing teff for hay. There are no labeled herbicide options for that particular annual grass species, and the EPA considers that a different grass group than some of the other grasses. So just want to mention that if you're considering or have used planted teff as a summer annual, the weed control side of it may be a little more challenging. So with that, I'm going to stop my sharing here, Philip, and see if I can answer a few questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. We had a comment about dealing with Japanese knotweed. We've got a producer that seems to be dealing with a lot of that. First question, I've heard about Sericea lespedeza, and I have seen it listed as a weed, but have read it's good for parasite control in goats. I don't want to grow something that may be considered invasive. Any considerations on your thoughts of Sericea lespedeza?
Yes, Sericea lespedeza is one of those plants that depends on which camp you're in, you either like it or hate it. For a lot of situations, Sericea lespedeza can get out of hand and become, somewhat invasive and dominate an area if it's allowed to do that. And then the other thing is, it is a legume, and it's later. I mean, by the time we get to midsummer, when the tannins start picking up into that plant, is when it becomes less desirable as a forage species. And it's not one that I would advocate to become established, but if you manage it appropriately, it can be used as a forage. In fact, I had an inquiry several years ago in West Kentucky where a guy was growing Sericea lespedeza for hay production, but you've got to cut it early, real early, and he was selling it as a horse hay, and evidently had a niche market for that. So it's one of those legumes that if it's managed appropriately, it could be utilized, but at the same time, if you just let it if you don't manage it, it can be a real problem, and it can be difficult to get rid of.
Okay, next question. We used to mix Prowl in the fertilizer for use in tobacco. Can this be effective for hay pastures as well?
Yes, certainly. I think you could impregnate Prowl onto fertilizer for hay or pasture use. It certainly is a way to maybe to get a well, it depends on how well you're spreading that fertilizer to get a good uniform stand. But the key to it again would be to applying that fertilizer at the right time of year to have it on the ground before those weed seeds germinate. If you put it on too early, the herbicide will degrade before those weeds germinate. If you put it on, after those weeds germinate, then it's going to be ineffective. What I cannot tell you by calendar date when is the best time to do that, because these weeds like foxtail and so forth, these annual grasses germinate depending on weather conditions, and certainly the temperature has to be there, but it's conducive for germination, along with the moisture, and then of course, as I said earlier, the sunlight. So when I'm thinking about at least grass hay fields, an alfalfa field, I think you can time that a little bit more because we tend to cut those a little more frequently than a grass hay field.
Okay, the last question I have. So if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat box. I have used crossbow in the pastures that had a lot of ironweed. Worked great. I didn't reseed the pasture, and now I have a full pasture of yellow buttercup. You would think I had sowed it. I didn't notice it in the pasture before. Is this common?
Well, buttercup is one of those plants that takes advantage of the open bare spots, and particularly fields that are heavily grazed in the fall and through the winter time. Part of that is by removing the ironweed, you remove some of the competition, for one, but you know, the buttercup, I think, you know, certainly the buttercup has become more common in let me back a step. When I first started seeing buttercup, is most of the southern tier counties across Kentucky, and then over time it has become more commonplace in more widely across the state, including and more so up in your area of the state as well. But I think the buttercup is a lot of times a function of a lot of open bare areas at the time that buttercup starts germinating, either in the fall and or we'll have another flush of buttercup germinating here as we come out of the winter months. But it's, again, it's an indication that you have a lot of open bare areas, more like it's indication a lot of open bare areas in those fields. So trying to correct that problem is probably is part of the equation, I think. Not always practical though, and particularly where the people that are like grazing horses, that there's not as much land area for those to move those animals around to some different field sites to give the grass a chance to be more competitive.
All right, next question. How can we make crabgrass disappear in alfalfa?
In alfalfa, I'm assuming this alfalfa probably has orchard grass, which is one of our dilemmas about weed control in alfalfa, is a lot of times it's interseeded with orchard grass. Again, it's one of those things when we're cutting the alfalfa, and that's either after the first cutting or second cutting, we're oftentimes cutting it to ground level, and that's just triggers that crabgrass germination. Now, again, the prowl can be used in alfalfa in that situation as well. So that may be something to think about, but trying to figure out the timing on that is depending on how, what our actual schedule of cutting is the alfalfa, how early we get that first cutting off. If it's real early, it may be too early to make that application then, but it may require the second application. If it's a later cutting alfalfa, then for the first cutting, then we may want to do it after the first cutting.
All right. Another question is, are you willing to share your slides of your presentation? And if you are, you can email them to me and I will send them out.
We can talk about that, Philip.
Okay, that'll work. Next question. So going back to Johnsongrass, if you decide to spray it, obviously you will sacrifice grass. Also, but what is the best herbicide to use to control Johnsongrass?
In grass hay, I'm assuming?
I'm assuming, yes.
That's just it. We do not have a herbicide that we can recommend for that situation. If it's a cool season grass, like orchard grass or fescue and so forth, there's not a herbicide product label for use as when the grass is used as a forage consumption. There are some that says non-cropland, which would that's such as what the highway department uses, but they don't have approval by the EPA for applications if it's going to be used for livestock purposes.
Okay, next question. Can you apply in an early spring application of 2,4-D in fields with clover to reduce the risk of damage to the clover?
I think there's a number of individuals have done that and been successful most years, more so with the white clover than the red clover. The red clover is going to be much more sensitive to any application. If it's beginning any active growth at all, it's going to be certainly much more sensitive than the white clovers or ladino clover species varieties.
Okay. Can double seeding rates, like a new grass seeding or a new clover seeding, be an effective management tool for weed suppression? strictly just increasing the seeding rates?
Yeah, certainly. If you can get that, get it seeded and up and growing, that competition. I guess that was one of the main points I was trying to make tonight, is that competition goes a long way towards weed control. Doesn't eliminate it, but particularly for the annual species that we see year in and year out.
We've got a comment from Jeff, and Jeff, we will get to that question on warm season grasses on February 15th. How toxic is hemp dogbane to cattle?
That is a plant that shows up in some of the literature about poisonous plants. I don't think it's as extremely toxic as, let's say, a poison hemlock, for example. It would take, I think you'd have to consume quite a bit of it to be an issue, is my understanding on hemp dogbane.
Gotcha. All right, last question I have. It says, you'll find a lot of people are for Johnsongrass and a lot of people are against Johnsongrass. Is it not a good nutrition for forage? And I think you commented on that one, Doc. And we'll get more into this one on the 15th as well. But if you don't, if you want to add two or three words to that, feel free.
Yeah, I lost my train of thought here. Yeah, Johnsongrass was introduced as a forage, and like a lot of other grasses in its earlier vegetative growth stages, it has some pretty decent nutritional value. I've had a few people comment to me in the last couple of years that they've quit fighting it, trying to control it in the grass hayfields, and now are trying to manage it more as a hay crop. But by doing that, is they're trying to get it cut before those seed heads become real prominent in those fields. So it means, you know, you're going to have, it's going to be needs to be cut earlier than we typically may want to cut a lot of the cool season grasses, hay, if that's the target.
Okay. Next question I've got is talking about reseeding, frost seeding some clovers into some weedy pastures. It would probably, this isn't the question, but I'm going to add in here, it would probably be a good idea to get control of the weeds before we do any frost seeding, correct?
That would be my thoughts, is that if you know you have a lot of weed pressure in some of these fields and you'd like to try to get those under control, it's probably better to target those for one season ahead of the you know, the season prior to seeding the clovers.
And Lynn, we'll get to the next part of your question in just a little bit later training. Crow's foot control, and I'm not sure which crop, Doc.
Well, probably talking about goosegrass. Some people call it crow's foot. Of course, crabgrass has kind of a similar type seed head, but what I'm thinking about is crow's foot is probably more the and it. I mean, I see it more often in fields or barn lots that have a lot of heavy foot traffic and so forth. I don't know if that's the plant they're thinking of or not. And it can dominate some areas that get particularly a lot of foot traffic or heavy, where soils are tight, heavy soils. There's not, again, any selective herbicide options to take that one out. You just have to make a decision. If it's a site that's not heavily utilized by animals, what can I do maybe to try to get some better grasses growing in those areas, starting with the fall seeding.
Well, that's going to wrap up our questions, Doc. I appreciate you taking time this evening to talk with us. I think April's got something she wants to talk to you all about.
Okay, well, thank you all very much.
All right, so we, as Philip talked earlier on, and some of you may have missed it, we do plan on having signs for those that attend every session. You do have to attend all of the sessions from now until the 15th. But in order to do that, to figure out what each farm name is, I have made a Qualtrics survey, and I'm posting right now the link in the chat for everyone to see. We'll email this out to y'all tomorrow as well. But just if you want to go ahead and click on that link, go ahead and copy it if you want to, if you don't want to click on it right now. And that way you can take that little quick survey, let us know what your farm name is and how you want it to be on the sign. Again, we will monitor to see who all does attend each session. And if y'all look at the participant list and you see that your name is not on there, please message me really quick and let me know. I know we have like an Evelyn. I'm not really sure who that one belongs to, if you can let me know. And then there's a couple of iPhones on here that I don't have a name associated with. And I think a LG phone. So if you can, just glance over there real quick, see if you're one of those people that do not have a name. That way we do not miss giving you credit, because otherwise we won't know that you were here, okay? So you can send that to me privately in a message real quick. And other than that, Philip, I can't think of anything else I need to talk about.
All right. Did get another question that came in the chat doc. Let's say you reseed with fescue and orchard grass in the early spring and then spray for weed control later in the summer. Is that a good idea?
If that grass gets to be about the 3 leaves stage or so, and one of the other things I like to look at is if I pull some of it up and see the root system is beginning to become fairly well developed, and it's probably mature enough to be treated with most herbicide, the broadleaf herbicides that we have. So the kicker to that is can we get the grass seeded early enough if we want to make an early summer application or a late spring application, probably. But once it has about usually if it comes up well after it's seeded within 6 weeks or so after the seeding, that it is probably getting to the point where it can tolerate a herbicide application. The young tender grasses, though, that doesn't have very much growth on, they can be a little susceptible sometimes even to 2,4-D. That's not a real black and white answer, I know, but it's just some general thoughts there.
All right. How long? Oops, sorry, it moved on me. How long before new grass seeding should be cut or used as pasture after seeding in a typical growing season? Any thoughts on that?
Well,
or we can pass that one off.
I think that would be a good one for your forage specialist to address. So I mean a lot of it is having a well-developed root system, so that when it does get cut or grazed, either one, that the grass has a chance to rebound and grow again.
Okay, we will follow up with one of our future speakers, probably the one next week. I have some horse nettle in my pastures. I obviously see the chart, but do you have any other recommendations?
I actually had a conversation with my former colleague earlier today about horse nettle, and I think his and my conclusions are that our best herbicide choices for horse nettle is either the Grazon or this new Duracore product. Basically, the aminopyrrolid products are our best choices. The other part of that is I would suggest doing it in late summer is the best time to make that application. Some fields where I have sprayed that had horse nettle in it, my best success is probably 80%, or maybe back up. Let me say 70 70 to 80%. It's fair, usually about fair is what I consider. There's always a few escapes. And it's unfortunate with horse nettle, that's different than even the tall ironweed. The network of roots are it's a network of small roots that can go several feet either down or out away from the mother plant. And that's what's difficult to get herbicide through that whole network of roots that exist underground. That's the challenge. Just like with Canada thistle. It's the underground root system is the real challenge to get enough herbicide into those plants with just a one-time effort.
Sounds great. I do know we have some people that are on the phone. If you all have questions and want to unmute, feel free to do that. While we are waiting, Miss Courtney Jenkins down in McGoffin County has a comment or two she wants to talk to you all about.
Hey, everybody. I just wanted to mention that the Kentucky Department of Agriculture is currently taking applications for their nuisance weed spraying program that they do every year. It may be a good opportunity for some of you folks to jump on board or fill out that application and get some free chemicals. If you're not familiar with that program, KDA provides a sprayer and enough chemical for 10 acres for you to control broadleaf weeds. You have to provide the tractor, the operator, and the water, but they accept applications every year from February 1st through February 29th, and they only accept 7 people per county. So I sent Philip the link to that application. It's very short and simple, but if that's something that you would be interested in, you can fill that out, and they bring the sprayer out to you and the chemical out to you. And they have a couple pieces of paper that you sign off on, and it's yours to use. So Philip can put that link in the chat box, and you guys can take a look at it and see if that's something you may be interested in.
I did put that in the chat box, and I will send that out in the email tomorrow along with the Quatrix survey. Doc, I think that's going to wrap us up. Guys, I hope everybody enjoyed it. Don't forget, next week will be February 8th, and it's going to be how to make high quality hay with Dr. Chris Toich. If you all have any questions or think of anything later, feel free to contact your local county agent, and if they don't know it, we will get the answer for you. Until next Monday, y'all be safe and stay warm.
Thank you again.
Thank you all.